Inside a glittering Manhattan restaurant, billionaire Isabella Vaughn stood frozen as her ex-lover Julian Pierce laughed in front of every guest at the table. He raised his glass and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You're too cold to ever be loved, Isabella. Nobody in this room will stand by you. Nobody." The crystal chandeliers hummed overhead. Forks stopped moving. Every eye turned toward her, waiting for the queen to break. Then a stranger stepped forward, placed one hand flat on the table, and said in a calm, low voice, "She's my wife." The restaurant was called Lumiere, perched on the 42nd floor of a glass tower above Park Avenue. Every table inside was a private negotiation. Every glass of wine cost more than most people earned in a day. The waiters moved like ghosts in black suits, trained to hear nothing and remember less. Caleb Morgan had worked there for almost 2 years. He was 34, quiet, with the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd unless someone bothered to look twice. Before Lumiere, he had been an army medic. Before that, he had been a kid from a small town in Pennsylvania nobody could find on a map. He didn't talk about either life. He poured wine. He cleared plates. He kept his head down. That was the deal he had made with himself the day he walked into New York City carrying $200 in a duffel bag. That Thursday evening, he was assigned to the private dining room on the West Wing. 8 guests, 1 reservation under the name Vaughn. He read the briefing card twice and said nothing. Isabella Vaughn arrived at 7:45 exactly, which meant she was 15 minutes late by Manhattan standards and perfectly on time by her own. She wore black. She always wore black. At 31, she controlled the logistics empire her father had built from nothing, and the boardrooms of Manhattan had learned to say her name carefully. She had a face magazines called Beautiful and bankers called Dangerous. She did not smile when she walked in. She rarely smiled at all. Caleb watched her from the side of the room as she greeted the table. He noticed the way she scanned the seats, counted the faces, calculated the angles. She was looking for someone. And when she found him, her shoulders tightened. Julian Pierce was already there, not in restaurants. In other countries. In other rooms. Around men who smiled while they destroyed people. Julian leaned forward. "Let's be honest, Isabella. The merger's going to fail. You know what?" The room stayed silent. Because nobody trusts a woman who has nothing to lose. No husband. No partner. No one waiting for her at home. He smiled slowly. The board talks. Investors talk. They look at you and they see a fortress. And nobody invests in a fortress. Then he delivered the final blow. "You're too cold to ever be loved. And nobody in this room is going to stand by you. Not tonight. Not ever." The silence afterward was unbearable. Not shock. Agreement. Investors looked down at their plates. One man adjusted his tie. Another checked his phone as if an imaginary notification had saved him from taking a side. Isabella did not blink. But Caleb saw her hand tighten around the napkin until her knuckles turned white. And suddenly he understood. This was not an argument. This was an execution. Julian was destroying the merger, destroying her reputation, destroying 2 years of work in front of the only people whose opinions mattered. And he was doing it because she had once refused to marry him. Caleb should have stayed out of it. He had trained himself for years not to interfere. He had a job, a quiet life. This was not his war. He told himself all of that in the span of 3 seconds. Then he set the bottle down. He walked across the carpet. He stopped beside Isabella's chair, placed one hand flat on the table, looked directly at Julian, and said, in a low, steady voice, "She's my wife." The room froze. Julian's smile twitched at the corners. One investor slowly lowered his fork onto the plate. Isabella turned and looked at Caleb for the first time. They had never spoken before. She studied him silently, and Caleb could see the exact second she understood what he was offering, and the cost of it. Then she made her decision. She slid her hand across the table and rested it gently over his. "Caleb prefers to keep our marriage private," she said calmly. "He doesn't enjoy these dinners. I asked him to come tonight as a favor." The room shifted immediately. People recalculated, rebuilt the story in their heads. Julian stared at Caleb like a man watching a stranger walk into his house and turn off the lights. "Your husband?" Julian asked flatly. "My husband," Isabella answered. Caleb did not sit down, did not speak again. He simply stood there while her hand rested on his, and let the lie become real in the silence between heartbeats. The dinner somehow continued after that. Conversations restarted carefully. The merger was never mentioned again that night. Julian drank quickly and left before dessert, looking back once from the doorway with an expression Caleb would never forget. When the last guest finally disappeared and the room was empty, Isabella stood. She adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. She didn't thank him, didn't apologize. She only looked at him for a long moment before sliding a white card across the table. "Tomorrow," she said. 9 a.m. My office. Then she walked away. Caleb stood alone in the empty dining room holding the card, while the white linen still carried the imprint of her fingers. He had spoken a lie that lasted less than 3 seconds. And somehow, he already knew it was going to change everything. The next morning, Caleb stood outside a Fifth Avenue skyscraper trying to convince himself not to go inside. He had barely slept. All night he had replayed those words in his head. "She's my wife." By 4 in the morning, he had decided he would end the lie cleanly. He would tell her he couldn't do this. Then he would return to Lumiere, pour wine, and forget her face forever. But when he stepped off the elevator onto the 38th floor, the receptionist already knew his name. That bothered him immediately. So did the way assistants stopped talking when he walked by. Rumors had already outrun him. Isabella waited inside a glass office overlooking Manhattan. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "You came," she said. "I came to tell you I'm out," Caleb replied. He remained standing. "Whatever happened last night, I'm sorry I complicated things. I'll sign whatever you need. I won't talk to anyone. I just want my life back." She studied him quietly. Then she slid a folder across the desk. "That's no longer possible," she said. Inside was a printout from a financial news site. Headline published at 6 a.m. Isabella Vaughn's secret marriage confirmed by sources at private dinner. There was a grainy photograph of her hand resting on his. By noon, she explained, every major firm in the city would have read it. By evening, the merger team would demand proof. By tomorrow, the board would want to meet him. "Then tell them the truth," Caleb said. "If I tell them the truth," Isabella replied calmly, "I lose the merger. $600 million in capital disappears. The board removes me. Julian takes the company." She stood and walked to the window. "My father built this company over 40 years. He left it to me 3 years ago, 1 week before he died. The board never wanted me in this chair. Last night wasn't just humiliation. It was a test." She turned to face him. He wanted to see if anyone would stand beside me. Silence stretched between them. Then she spoke again. "I'm asking you to keep doing it. 90 days. Until the merger closes." 90 days. Caleb repeated. 90 days, she confirmed. "After that, we separate quietly. You walk away with enough money to never pour wine again." He should have refused. He had rehearsed the refusal all night. But he remembered Julian's smile. Remembered the investors staring at their plates while Isabella sat there alone. And somehow, against all logic, he heard himself say, 90 days. From that moment on, everything changed. He moved into her apartment on Central Park West because staff talked and appearances mattered. He learned names, faces, executives, investors. She taught him who to trust and who to avoid. At first, their marriage was performance. Nothing more. Separate bedrooms, separate routines. But slowly, without either of them noticing, something began to shift. It happened in quiet kitchens at midnight, in exhausted conversations after board meetings, in long car rides where neither of them spoke because silence had stopped feeling uncomfortable. Caleb saw how lonely power really was, and Isabella slowly realized what it felt like not to stand alone. Julian, meanwhile, grew more dangerous. He investigated Caleb's past, fed rumors to reporters, questioned the legitimacy of the marriage publicly. At a charity gala, he cornered them beside a table of champagne flutes. "You're a ghost," Julian told Caleb with a smile. "No marriage record, no photos, no history. You should have picked someone with a longer paper trail." Then he leaned closer. "I'm going to enjoy this." The pressure escalated. The board interrogated Caleb for hours. Regulators began asking questions. And still, every time Isabella looked like she might finally break, Caleb stood beside her. Not because he was paid to anymore, because he wanted to. One night, after a brutal board meeting, Isabella entered the kitchen barefoot with her hair down for the first time he had ever seen. "You did well today," she told him softly. "They didn't believe me," he answered. "They didn't have to," she said. "They only had to fail to prove otherwise." Then, after a long silence, she finally asked the question that had been waiting between them for weeks. "Why did you do it?" she asked. That night at the restaurant. Caleb thought carefully before answering. Because nobody else was going to. She looked at him quietly. And I knew what that felt like. For the first time. Since meeting her, Isabella Vaughn looked not powerful, but tired and human. 3 weeks before the merger closed, disaster struck. An anonymous complaint reached regulators accusing Isabella of fraud regarding her marital status. The board called an emergency session. 23 executives filled the room. When the chairman demanded proof the marriage was real, Isabella sat perfectly still. If the board trusts me, she said calmly, this conversation ends now. If not, vote me out. It was a bluff. Everyone knew it. Then the chairman turned toward Caleb. Mr. Morgan, he asked, would you like to add anything? Caleb looked around the room. At the men questioning her. At Isabella sitting there wrapped in composure like armor. And suddenly he understood something important. The quiet life he thought he was protecting no longer existed. It had ended the moment he crossed the carpet at Lumiere. So he looked the chairman directly in the eyes. I stand by my wife, he said. The room fell silent. The merger survived. But only barely. That same night, Julian made his final move. He contacted Caleb privately and sent him an old military photograph tied to a painful incident Caleb had buried for nearly a decade. Attached was a draft article ready for publication. The headline linked Caleb's past to Isabella's company. A scandal. A cover-up. A federal investigation waiting to happen. When Isabella read it in the apartment kitchen, her expression finally cracked. You need to leave, she told him quietly. If you disappear now, the story dies with you. And the merger? Caleb asked. It dies too, she admitted. But I survive smaller. Then she looked at him with something fragile in her eyes. Go, Caleb. For the first time in her life, she was choosing a person over power. And Caleb understood that. He also understood something else. No, he said. She blinked. I'm not leaving. Julian thinks I'm the weak point. He's wrong. By sunrise, they had a plan. Not illegal. Precise. Julian had a history of manipulating confidential records. Former colleagues were finally willing to testify against him. At 11 that morning, Caleb met Julian alone inside a luxury hotel bar. Julian laid out his offer calmly. Confessed the marriage was fake. Blame Isabella. And he would bury the article. Caleb listened patiently. Then he placed his own folder on the table. Inside were sworn affidavits, evidence of extortion, documentation proving Julian had illegally accessed confidential records. The smile finally disappeared from Julian's face. You're bluffing, Julian muttered. You can find out at noon, Caleb replied. Then he stood up and walked away. The article never ran. Julian signed a legal agreement before 2 p.m. Within weeks, he disappeared from public business circles entirely. And 2 weeks later, the merger officially closed at a higher valuation than projected. That night, Isabella came home just before midnight. Caleb was waiting in the kitchen. Again, it had become their place somehow. The only room small enough for honesty. The contract ends in 9 days, she said quietly. I know. She looked at him carefully, then finally lowered the armor she had worn her entire life. I want to ask you something, she said. Not as your employer. Not as the woman who pulled you into this. She took a breath. I'm asking as Isabella. Caleb waited. I want the marriage to be real. The words hung between them. Not for the company. Not for the board. Not for anyone else. Her voice almost shook on the word me. I've spent my entire life being the person nobody stood beside. You stood beside me before you even knew my name. Caleb looked at her across the counter. Thought about the restaurant. The boardrooms. The lies. The late-night conversations. And the way husband had stopped feeling like a role weeks ago. I haven't been pretending for a while, he admitted. Softly. I know, she whispered. Then he smiled. Yes. They married for real on a Wednesday afternoon in a small downtown office. No photographers. No announcements. No headlines. Just 2 assistants as witnesses and a notary who had no idea who they were. She wore black. He wore the same suit from the gala. And before the close of business that day, the certificate was officially filed. People later told different versions of how it all began. Investors remembered one story. The board remembered another. Julian Pierce told his own version to anyone still willing to listen. Fewer and fewer people were. But Caleb eventually understood the truth. The lie had never built anything. It had only bought them time. Everything real between them, the trust, the partnership, the quiet kitchens after midnight, had been built inside the space that lie created. The lie was only a door. They were the ones who walked through it together. And what waited on the other side became real because they chose it. In a world built on power, status, and judgment, people are not defined by the position they hold. They are defined by who they choose to stand beside when nobody forces them to. Caleb Morgan had once crossed a carpet in a private dining room high above Manhattan. He had spoken two simple words, and without realizing it, he had chosen the rest of his life.